Alright you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out you guys, before I get into this story, let me just tell you guys what happened late Thursday night. Some of you probably already know this because I posted it in the community section sometime late Friday. But after I recorded this video the first time and had it ready to be dropped for a late Friday night drop, I somehow ended up losing the video. My computer glitched out and I lost it. And I'm literally talking about after I had finished everything, putting the pictures in, the intros, the outros, incorporating the background music, everything was done. And then my computer glitched out and I lost it. I don't know how it happened. I can't explain it. Sometimes I think my computer has a mind of its own. I spent hours trying to find that video. I literally went through every corner of my computer, but I couldn't find it. So this is my second attempt at putting this story out. But like they say, sometimes the second go around is better than the first time. At any rate, I'm back on it. I'm gonna try to get this story out to you guys by Monday or Tuesday at the latest. And this story right here is a banger. Like a lot of the recent stories that I put out, this is another story that's coming to you guys straight out of the LA County Jail. You know, and this probably ain't gonna end up being one of my longer stories. However, I'm gonna put it in context and give it to you guys the same way that it was conveyed to me. And here's the other thing. I'm not keeping track of how many stories I've told you guys that have taken place in the LA County Jail, but I know it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 7 or 8, and most of those occurred on the maximum security tiers. High power, deep seg, 1750, the gang modules in 3200, etc, etc. And obviously the reason for that is because this is where all the hitters are at. And this is where they house all the inmates that are gang affiliated. But that's the reason why this story is going to be a little different, because unlike those other stories, this one happened in the area of the jail that's considered to be in the general population, or on the main line, where you get a little bit of everything. And again, this is significant because I'm not exactly sure how they got it set up in the LA County Jail, but a lot of the times on the maximum security tiers, they're segregated based on gang affiliation and ethnicity. So in a lot of these stories, if you guys notice, I've spent a good amount of time talking about the layout and the schematics of how some of these housing units were constructed, and I did it for a purpose, to basically help you guys get a visual of these environments and a basic sense of how some of these guys were able to get away with these assaults. You know, obviously there's a lot of you that haven't been to the LA County Jail, and this includes myself as well, and we're gonna keep it that way. But hopefully I can still put you guys in the moment and give you an accurate description of how some of these incidents transpired. Anyways, as I've alluded to in some of my past stories, the LA County Jail is a massive complex that consists of 9 separate facilities. So you got the Inmate Reception Center, Men's Central Jail, the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, Pitches Detention Center, which also includes East, North, South, and North County facilities. And then you also have the Century Regional Detention Facility located in Linwood that houses the women. And with respects to the LA County Jail, I'm just going to say this. You know, there's a lot of different county jails across the state of California, both up north and down south, that are considered to be small war zones. Or depending on your affiliation, you can call them no-fly zones. They're tough jails. But these are places where you got to go in there with your head on a swivel and stay on your toes. You know, just based on what I know about the LA County Jail and what I've heard about it before in the past, I'd even go out on a limb and say that it's probably the most violent county jail in the state of California. And I say this when you obviously consider several different factors, such as the amount of inmates that jail holds, the number of gang members that are there at any given time, and the caliber of inmates that are spread throughout that entire jail. And then you definitely can't forget another thing that this jail is treacherous and has a long-standing reputation for. And that's the reputation that the deputies themselves have earned insofar as forming one of the biggest criminal-based law enforcement gangs in the country. You know, some would say that this was all effectuated behind the death of Deputy Abel Escalante, who was allegedly taken out on the streets by gang members. This was kind of like the catalyst that opened up the door and set everything off. Because other deputies felt like Escalante had been specifically targeted based on the fact that he was a deputy that worked at the LA County Jail. So for a lot of the other deputies that were working at the LA County Jail after he was taken out on the streets, it was payback time, and it was all about avenging his untimely death. You know, the culmination of wanting to get revenge and a deep disdain for gang members was a deadly combination. And it was a mentality that was fostered and encouraged from working in an environment like the LA County Jail. You know, the deputies began pushing that us against them mentality, and before you knew it, they started ascribing to a brotherhood type credo amongst themselves that eventually morphed into several gangs of their own. But trip out on this, when they ran an investigation on the presence of these gangs, they actually found a booth that the deputies worked in that was struck up with gang-style graffiti by deputies who had identified themselves and their affiliation with the gang that called themselves the 3000 Boys. You know, there was over 10 different gangs that were formed by the deputies that worked for LASD. Some of those gangs included the Wayside Whiteys, the Banditos, the Executioners, the Reapers, the Linwood Vikings, and the 3000 Boys are some of the more prominent ones that I could think of. And they even had insignias that they would tattoo on themselves to represent their affiliation and loyalty to one of these different gangs. In this picture, you can even see these guys throwing up 3 fingers to represent the 3000 Boys or the 3000 floor where they worked in the jail. You know, I don't want to get off track, but this kicked off a huge scandal within the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. And I think it's important for you guys to know this, especially for those of you that don't know nothing about it, because then it gives you a better sense of how bad things really were in that jail. You know, even the jail's leadership was involved in this scandal. Paul Tanaka, who at one point in time became the undersheriff for LASD, was a self-admitted Linwood Viking. You know, these guys were off the hook. They were accused of beating, torturing, and even murking inmates. One was an African-American inmate named John Horton, who had his life taken under highly suspicious circumstances. And then, in an effort to cover it up, they tried to make it look like he committed suicide. And I know you guys all remember the cell extractions that they did on August 25, 2008 on the 3100 and 3300 rolls at the Men's Central Jail. This was free reign and a perfect opportunity for them to get their runbacks for Deputy Abel Escalante. And they definitely did. They put a vicious hurting on some of those guys. But this was also the turning point in that whole scandal because it kind of let the cat out the bag. Anyways, it was these type of deputies that worked there and the type of cutthroat games that they had been known to play that you had to be careful of. You had to not only be on your toes when it came to the other inmates, but also with the deputies as well. You know, all these things coupled together make this jail a dangerous environment to be in. And I know that there's probably going to be people that are going to disagree and say, no, my county jail is probably crazier, this county jail is crazier than that. But I'd be willing to bet that it's probably coming from people that have never been there themselves. You know, one thing I can definitely say is that I've talked to a lot of Crips, Bloods, ABs, Nazi lowriders, Sureños, and even Mexican Mafia members themselves. And they all shared the same general sentiment when it came to that jail. They basically said that if you could survive and make it in the LA County Jail, then you could pretty much make it and survive anywhere else. But anyways, the other thing about some of these general population housing units is that some of these areas of the jail are more susceptible to race riots, gang fights, and just mass violence on all levels. You know, sometimes certain groups just can't coexist together because maintaining order and equilibrium over your own people is manageable. But it becomes to be a little bit more complicated when you try to apply that same protocol to other groups. They don't always comply, and this is where the conflict starts. Whether issues kick off over the phones, the TVs, jail real estate, meaning laying claim to things like tables, benches, cells, showers, bathroom facilities, or an area or a side of the building, there's always issues that end up creating problems. You know, and a lot of the times it's the younger guys who end up creating a lot of the unnecessary conflict. Just imagine 30 or 40 guys that are all crammed into one small housing unit that's usually packed out and overcrowded, who are expected to get along and make their own rules. You know, for the most part, a lot of the time the older guys who've been around and who've navigated through the system can get it done because they have to, and they're open to diplomacy. But sometimes that don't even work. I mean, you're dealing with a lot of different people with a lot of different characters. And jail's already a hostile environment because everybody's all wound up and pissed off just based on the fact that they're locked up. But anyways, unfortunately, at the time that this incident kicked off, there was already racial tension and racial disparities amongst the Africanos, or the African American inmates, and the Southsiders. And before I go on, let me just say this. I hope nobody misconstrues the term Africanos when I'm making reference to the black inmates, because I use this term as a showing of respect and as a form of endearment. You know, I'm from the old school. We were laced up different. So again, I say it as a showing of respect. Anyways, based on the fact that the Sureños fell up under the Mexican Mafia's tutelage, you could pretty much say that this conflict was between the Africanos and the Mexican Mafia. So this particular incident took place on January 12, 2004 and involved over 100 inmates. And I'm not sure what the exact numbers look like insofar as who might have been deeper, but from the impression that I got, the numbers were pretty much even. So as for 2900, from my understanding, it was laid out the same way as the gang module in 3200. You had 2 tiers, an upper tier and a lower tier. Able row being the bottom tier, and then you had Baker row on top. But here's where these 2 tiers were different. So on one side of Able row, you had the cells, and then on the other side against the wall, you had 18 double bunk beds. For those of you that have been to San Quentin in the early 2000s, this is how they had some of the designated overflow inmates in Donner section, Badger section, Alpine section, and West Block. block. And this wasn't just in San Quentin, this was almost in every prison across the state of California. Overcrowding was a statewide problem. But whether it was in the gyms or out on the tiers, this was obviously a different way of doing time, as you had people walking around in common areas and you were basically exposed. I mean, it's dorm living. When you're assigned to a cell, that cell becomes your sanctuary. That's your own little small piece of real estate within that prison. And trust me, it has its advantages. It becomes your safe house, a place where you hide your contraband, a place where you sharpen your weapons, and one of the only places where you can go and get away from that whole underworld that you're stranded in. But when you're not living in a cell and you're in an open environment like this, it changes the dynamics of everything. How you navigate, how others navigate, and how you function as a collective. So between the cells and the bunk beds that were located out on the tier, there was an open walkway that was referred to by the inmates and even the deputies as Broadway. This was like their main thoroughfare from one end of the module to the other. And here's another detail that would later become a contributing factor. So the deputies that worked in that part of the jail opted to leave the cell doors open during the shower program so that the inmates could continue to shower and use the toilets. Something that conflicted with the jail's security policies. But unbeknownst to them at the time, this would later be identified as a major security breach and a contributing factor to something that would end up happening later in this housing unit between the Africanos and the Southsiders. Because although this accommodated the inmates who wanted to shower and use the toilets while they ran program on the tier, this also gave the inmates access at retrieving contraband, flushing contraband, and using the cells to obscure illicit activity. Anyways, like I was saying earlier, these type of open dorm environments have always been known to become hotbeds and fertile ground for escalating conflicts between different group segments. And a lot of the times, it's the TVs and phones that are at the center of it. You get somebody who wants to control and dictate what everybody else wants to watch on TV, or somebody who wants to control the amount of phones that are allotted to each ethnic group, or dictate the time slots that are supposed to be distributed on a rotating basis. You know, something else that often factors in is the numbers. From experience, I've noticed that whatever group's got the numbers, over time, they'll begin getting testy, and eventually they'll start trying to dictate and dominate the program under the dictates of that whole mass majority mentality, or the biggest bully on the block mentality. You know, sometimes you might have the numbers, but sometimes numbers don't mean nothing. You know, and again, I don't know what kind of steps these guys took to resolve this issue, but it sounded like there was several incidents of disrespect that ended up leading to this incident. And it was all behind the usual stuff, the TVs, the phones, the shower lineup, etc., etc. But the main issue that continued to create reoccurring problems between these two groups all stemmed from the nighttime shutdown policy, or the fact that there was allegedly a small group of Africanos who stayed up at night and who basically refused to comply with the nighttime shutdown policy. Or to clarify this, it wasn't so much that they were deliberately refusing to comply with this policy, it was the fact that they kept having to be told over and over, and it just kept happening. Somebody would tell them to shut it down and to respect the program, and then they'd be cool for a couple of days, but eventually they'd go right back to doing it. And this is where the Sureños were losing their patience. You know, whether you're in a county jail or in a state or federal prison, the active inmates will always comply with that facility's shutdown policy, regardless of what or when it is, because it's basically established under a collective agreement by all the different group segments. And nobody's bigger than the program. And again, this isn't about one group trying to dictate the program for everyone else. The terms of the agreement are decided by them all as a collective, and then they're not only expected to follow it, but they're also expected to enforce it amongst their own people as well. So in case some of you don't understand what the shutdown is, let me give you the short definition. I'm sure that most of you have heard the term program used when it comes to jail or prison. And what this basically means is how these guys function with respect to their daily activities. When they get up, when they work out, what time they eat, what time they study, when they go out to the yard, and other things that they do throughout the course of the day. That's the program. Every part of the daily routine is established and it's all coordinated under a set time. That's prison, and that's what doing time's all about. You know, the time obviously varies from prison to prison, but usually the program will open up sometime around 5 or 6 a.m. in the morning and will run all the way up until around 10 or 11 p.m. at night. You know, you guys got to understand that during the day, these types of environments get extremely loud. You can't hear nothing. You got guys playing cards and dominoes, others yelling over each other from cell to cell. Then you got the TV that's usually turned turned all the way up, and then you got guys that are doing exercises calling out cadences. So at nighttime, when these guys hear this announcement, it's basically a heads up letting everyone know that the daily program is over for the day, and that out of respect for everyone to bring the noise level down to a minimum, that people are going to sleep and that they're shutting it down. And like I said, in the morning it's done again to let everyone know that it's program time, that it's time to get suited and booted, and that it's time to get active. So if there's a group of individuals who aren't respecting the shutdown, despite the fact they've been warned several times, something like this can end up leading to escalating tensions and eventually a conflict. And that's what obviously happened here. So according to my source, one of the other contributing factors to this incident that led to it escalating to an all-out melee is the fact that the Africanos didn't step up and deal with their own people. You know, I guess this had been addressed several times before it got to this point, and when you don't regulate your own or weed out the problematic individuals who are responsible for creating the problems, this sends out the wrong kind of message. Either one, that they were supporting it by not taking corrective action, or two, that they just weren't taking it serious, and that maintaining respect and harmony amongst other groups that they were cohabiting with just wasn't a priority. So case in point, after exhausting all their attempts at trying to find a peaceful resolution, and after going about this the right way by trying to get at some of the older Africanos who had done time and who had been around, the Sureños had basically reached their threshold and were done with diplomacy. At any rate, there was a Llavero in 2900 who I refer to as Pirate from Eastside Longo, and it was Pirate's responsibility to oversee that module and to make sure that it was running in accordance to the Mexican Mafia's protocol. His job as a Llavero not only consisted of making sure that this module was in line with all of the Mexican Mafia's set policies, but he was also responsible for the guardianship of all Sureños in that module, their well-being, and of course to ensure that their presence and integrity was being respected as well. So after taking all the steps that he did to resolve this issue, and after basically getting nowhere, Pirate reached out to 1750, where the jail's Mexican Mafia leadership was housed, and advised them that he was at an impasse and was seeking direction. He explained what the issue was, everything that he had done to resolve it, and that despite his best efforts, it was falling on deaf ears. And unfortunately at the time, because of all the mounting racial disparities that had been escalating in Southern California, due in part behind a lot of the high-profile cases that had taken place out there, as well as other isolated incidents in the county jail, the Mexican Mafia's leadership didn't even think twice about sanctioning the green light on the Africanos in that part of the jail. You know, from my experience, I think that relationship has always been tenuous and kind of feeble for the most part, and I think a lot of it just has to do with the streets and Southern California's gang culture. Northern California is a little different, and that level of animosity has never existed out here. But again, this was just a bad time with regards to all the racial tension in LA between the black and Mexican gangs. Highland Park, the Avenues, and Florencia 13 would all later be involved in high-profile cases that were all considered to be racially motivated. The Pedro Espinosa case would happen a few years later, along with the racial homicides that were committed by Merced Cambero Jr., Shadow from the Avenues. And then yet even worse, a few years later, several Big Hazard gang members had been arrested and convicted for the racially motivated fire bombings that occurred in the Ramona Gardens housing projects. And as you can see from some of these still frames, it happened at night. And for a lot of the older Africanos that came from the deep south, this was all reminiscent of the days of the old, when some of the black churches were firebombed and targeted by the racial hatred that was being directed at them by white people. What happened in the Ramona Gardens housing projects is still remembered as an ugly part of LA's history. And even though it's been years since all this happened, the residuals are still there, and this relationship is still being mended. Anyways, once Pirate got the green light to move on the Africanos in 2900, he basically put a crew of some of the more seasoned Sureños together and instructed them to start fashioning as many weapons as they could find. Whatever they could use as weapon stock, they used. And when you're in a desperate situation like this is when you gotta improvise and rely on your schooling to construct weapons out of whatever you can find. I mean, let's be real though, it's not rocket science. Anything that's indurated enough to break or puncture flesh and hurt someone is considered to be a weapon. Plastic, wood, steel, and even paper rolled up tight enough to bring it back to its wood form to where it could then be used to stab someone. I actually have a video on my channel where I make a banger out of paper and go through the step-by-step process of putting a point on it. So when Pirate was scouting out some of the more influential Sureños that he would later delegate leadership positions to, or those who would assist with making the weapon, one of those prospects was a guy named Guillermo Navarro, who's also known as Spanky from Canoga Park. According to my source, Pirate appointed several different crews that were going to attack the Africanos in different areas of the module, and Spanky was one of several shooters who was going to be armed with the weapon. They made as many weapons out of the weapon stock that they had, but there just wasn't enough to make a weapon for every sureño that was going to be involved. So a good number of them had bangers, but those that didn't armed themselves with other makeshift weapons, such as socks that either had apples or bars of soap in them, broken sections of plumbing pipe, broken broom handles, etc., etc. So on the night of January 11, 2004, Pirate, along with all his meseros and all those who were appointed to lead one of several crews, finished formulating their plan of attack and were ready to carry it out. So the plan was to kick it off the following day on an unsuspecting group of younger Africanos who were assigned to the bunk beds that were out on the tier. They had made it a habit out of a daily routine where they would congregate by the bunk beds and they would either shoot craps or they would be at the tables gambling. And because Pirate identified this as being a vulnerable time for these guys, this is when they intended on hitting them. So Spanky was going to lead one of 3 crews that would initiate the attack somewhere on Broadway by the bunk beds. So according to my source, Pirate designated several different targets that not only consisted of some of the younger Africanos who were responsible for not respecting the shutdown policy, but also other targets that were considered to be a threat based on their physical stature and others who were known to be a part of their leadership. In other words, he didn't just target the main perpetrators that this conflict had originated over, but he also went after the brains and those who were considered to be a threat based on their physical size. So on the morning of January 12, 2004, at approximately 10:30 a.m. in the morning, all the sureños in 2900 armed themselves and took up different positions based on the crews that they were appointed to. Altogether, there was somewhere close to 100 inmates combined that would be involved in this melee. And although there was some level of tension in the air, apparently the Africanos never seen this coming. A lot of them were caught off guard, either on their bunks asleep, in the showers, or they were out at the tables gambling. So Spanky, along with Carlos Barajas, who's also known as Smiley from Florencia 13, and Alfred Renteria, who they call Shadow from East LA 13, were in the southeast corner on the bottom tier with about 15 or 20 other sureños. They were right off of the open walkway in front of Broadway doing push-ups and calisthenics, acting like they were doing their daily exercise routine. I don't know why the Africanos never seen this coming. Either they had gotten real lax and complacent, or maybe the sureños used to engage in this type of routine every morning. I don't know, I can't call it. But anytime you get more than 5 or 6 individuals together that you consider to be your ops, this is always a cause for concern. So as the sureños engaged in their exercises, 2 Africanos who claimed to be affiliated with the Crips, Brendan Johnson, who they call Petey Wack, and Christopher Fay, who was also known as Little Vamp, were on Broadway walking laps and apparently oblivious to the impending danger that they were now in. When Petey Wack and Little Vamp got to the end of Broadway and were doubling back in the other direction, one of the younger sureños punched Little Vamp in the face, and this set off the entire riot. Get that apple, homie. You know, I had to hit you guys with a little bit of that for old time's sake. You know, at first, Petey Wack attempted to fight back a wave of sureños that rushed both him and Little Vamp, but these guys didn't stand a chance. They got caught slipping, and these guys had bangers. You know, I'm not sure if Little Vamp was one of the designated targets, but based on what happened next, it definitely seemed like he was. Because right after the younger sureños snaked him, a crew of about 10 sureños swarmed in and went after Little Vamp. They started stabbing him, hitting him with socks that had bars of soap or apples in them. Bing, bop, brah, bing, bing, bop. One swooped in with a section of plumbing pipe, and then others were just kicking and punching him. You know, there was so many of these guys on him that all he could do was backpedal and try to get away. And that's what he did. He ran down to the other end of Broadway, but because they were all over him, he ran into a cell thinking that he'd be able to get away and protect himself. But this actually ended up being a fatal mistake. When Little Vamp ran into cell 4, he was followed by Spanky, Smiley, Shadow, and allegedly 2 others. Enrique Lopez Thumper from Venice and Carlos Aguilera, who they called Lefty from City Terrace. You know, I'm sure Little Vamp's thinking was to get to a cell so that he could either lock himself in there or use the small confines of a cell to his advantage so that he could limit the open area around him. But when something like this happens and you go into fight or flight mode, you don't always have a lot of time to think things all the way through. Because instead of limiting the open area around him and using the cell as a barrier of protection, he actually trapped himself and cut off any chances of getting away. You know, there was only one way out of that cell, and in order to get to it, he had to get past all 5 of them. You know, according to my source, Little Vamp was pinned down on the floor and was repeatedly stabbed by at least 3 of these guys. There was 5 of them in the cell with him, but there wasn't enough room for everyone to maneuver around and stab them from where they were at. So later, one of the inmates that didn't participate in this melee testified that he seen Spanky straddle Little Vamp, and that as Little Vamp laid on his stomach, he was stabbed by Spanky, who looked like he was aiming for his heart and other internal organs. You know, I've said this over and over, and I think the story that I did on one of the Salinas Valley homicides that was titled The Devil's Playground really resonated on this point and gave a lot of the viewers a first-hand look at how stabbing someone to death is one of the most intimate and personal ways of taking someone's life. The intimacy comes from the fact that you're spilling their blood and that you're literally causing their life to bleed out. You know, it's not the same as walking up to someone and shooting them. You can feel their body react every time you stab them when you're holding the handle. But Spanky apparently didn't care about anyone seeing him or the consequences that he would later face for his participation in this homicide. And later, he would not only make this clear, but he would also make it clear that his resolve was to continue to keep pushing a hard line and that he wasn't concerned about spending the rest of his life in prison. So while all this was happening on Abel Road, some of the Africanos that were caught on the upper tier on Baker Road were being thrown over the railing. And because a lot of the Africanos had dispersed and were in areas of the module by themselves, this made them even more vulnerable. And according to my source, there were so many Sureños swinging socks that had bars of soap and apples in them that it looked like there was little windmills all over the module. So during the first 2 or 3 minutes, it was straight pandemonium on every corner of the module. There was close to 100 inmates that were involved in this conflict. They were all over the bunks. They were throwing garbage cans. Others were throwing cups, books, trays, whatever they could get their hands on. But just as fast as it had all started, it ended just as fast as well. The deputies came in the module mossy deep and started yelling at everyone to get out on the floor and prone out, and they all complied too. Unlike prison where they keep going even after 3 or 4 applications of pepper spray, these guys all proned out and they complied. Maybe because they knew that anyone who resisted was going to be guaranteed one of those old school elevator rides or one of them full-on secret squirrel attitude checks. And I'm sure nobody wanted to give them a reason to justify giving them a good thumping. Either way, as the deputies began cuffing everyone up and regaining control of the module, Little Vamp's body was found in a pool of blood in cell 4 not long after the deputies entered the module. He was then taken to the jail's medical infirmary where life-saving measures were performed. However, despite their best efforts, Little Vamp succumbed to his injuries. Too much time had elapsed and he had sustained too many injuries that were considered to be fatal. The medical examiner would later determine that he had been stabbed 26 times, that he was beaten, and that he had also suffered a significant amount of head trauma. And later, several inmates testified at Spanky, Smiley, and Shadow's trial, and these guys buried them. They all testified that they personally seen Vamp being stabbed in the face, neck, head, and upper body. One particular individual, the same one I mentioned earlier, a guy named Victor Munoz, testified that he seen Spanky, who he identified as the tall, stocky guy who had Canoga Park tattooed on the back of his head, straddle Little Vamp and stab him numerous times in his back. This witness was interviewed by a well-known gang expert who's now retired named Richard Valdemar. And Valdemar also testified that Spanky was an active member of the Canoga Park, Alabama gang. So when this guy Munoz was interviewed on February 4, 2004, he was asked to identify Little Vamp's attackers. And the interview started out with him being admonished that he was under no legal obligation to cooperate, but that the only requirement was for him to be honest and to tell the truth. So the interview was recorded and would later be played for the jury. And during this interview, this guy Munoz was shown 3 different 6-packs of pictures to see if he could positively identify any of Little Vamp's attackers. So for those of you that don't know, a 6-pack is a lineup of 6 pictures of different guys who have similar features and who resemble one of the suspected people that they believe might be involved. It could be 6 random guys and it may or may not include one of the suspects. But unfortunately for these guys, this guy Munoz positively identified Spanky in the first 6-pack, identified Smiley in the second 6-pack, and identified Shadow in the third 6-pack. You know, this case ended up being a slam dunk for the prosecution because aside from this guy Munoz who claimed he personally seen Little Vamp being stabbed, there was also 3 other inmates who claimed that they also witnessed Little Vamp being stabbed as well. Robert Betch, Mark Wise, and Petey Wack testified himself. And these guys talked about everything they witnessed and identified everyone who they seen with the weapon. You know, they also used Jose Orozco's crime, who's also known as Seppi from Hawaiian Gardens, as a predicate offense, which is typical in these kind of cases. For example, in my indictment, they used Brown Bob's homicide as a predicate offense to prove to the jury that the Nuestra Familia was continued in a pattern of criminal activity. It had nothing to do with the case at hand, but they presented it in the same context. So Valdemar ended up testifying as a gang expert, and he explained to the jury that Seppi shot and took out Deputy Jerry Ortiz to benefit his own standing as a Sureño gang member, and that he was striving to elevate his status, and that he was hoping that one day he would also become a made member of the Mexican Mafia. And this was done to prove to the jury that these guys took out Little Vamp to benefit their own standings as Sureño gang members. Again, in the same context, Valdemar also testified about the structure of the Sureño movement and how all Sureños fell under the umbrella of the Mexican Mafia. He went into the dynamics of the internal workings, how they facilitated their communications during court movement and other movement. He broke down the hierarchy, the reglas, the leadership structure, and then the formal and informal tasks of Sureños and how they operate under the auspices of the Mexican Mafia. And this was done to prove that these guys were acting under the orders of the Mexican Mafia in the jail, that they were part of a pecking order, and that they couldn't act under their own accord. They always introduce this type of inflammatory evidence to blow the case up and to make sure that their enhancements stick. Like the Brown Bob homicide, Deputy Jerry Ortiz's homicide didn't have anything to do with this case. But yet, this is how the legal game works. They introduce evidence for the purpose of demonstrating motive and purpose, and that's how it's justified. And here's the kicker. When they present certain evidence, the jury's advised by the judge to only consider that evidence for one purpose, but to exclude it and disregard it for all other purposes of the case. It's crazy how that works. Once something is said, it doesn't get wiped out of your memory because someone tells you to disregard it. Once it's said, it's said. Almost like they think jurors have the ability to come in there and act like programmed hard drives. Like they'll be able to come in there and apply evidence to one set of facts, and then they'll be able to disregard it when considering the rest of the case. So after Valdemar testified, they had another detective from the Los Angeles Police Department named Jose Gonzalez come in and testify as a gang expert. And his whole purpose for coming in there was basically to testify about his personal knowledge and experience with regards to the Canoga Park, Alabama gang. According to his testimony, he had personally dealt with Spanky before in the past, and he had extensive experience working in the field with other Canoga Park street gang members. He's the one that basically helped them put the nail in Spanky's coffin. And then finally in the end, they had a criminologist named Stephen Schleib come in and testify about all the evidence that he gathered and all the pictures that he took in module 2900. In total, there was 57 items of evidence collected. The first set of pictures showed a bloodstained towel, a sock containing an apple, and bloodstains on the floor. In cell 1 on Able Row, a picture showed a metal pipe that measured approximately 26 inches long. Other pictures showed a second metal bar, 2 apples in a sock, 2 white socks containing 3 handmade knives, a bloodstained sheet, 2 halves of a broken broomstick, a dry pool of blood on Able Row, a bag of trash that contained a handmade banger, 2 bloodstained t-shirts, a bloodstained t-shirt that was on the floor of cell 5 on Able Row, a handmade knife in the toilet, a handmade knife on the ledge of a vent, bloodstains on the sink in cell 5 of Able Row, bloodstains on the floor outside of cell 5 of Able Row, and a bloodstained t-shirt on the lower bunk just outside of cell 5 of Able Row. Altogether, 13 shanks were found and collected, including 4 from Baker Row. So according to some of the sheriff's reports, deputies received several items of clothing from several different inmates, but no clothing from Spanky, Lefty, Smiley, Shadow, or Thumper. They were either smart enough to flush him or to have a fresh set to throw on after. So apparently this criminologist Schleib examined Spanky's hands and swabbed him for the presence of Little Vamp's DNA, but he couldn't find any. The only other inmate that Schleib examined was Roland Martinez, who was also known as Sleepy from Diamond Bar. And apparently Schleib didn't find any noticeable DNA on him or in his cell either. As you guys can see based on the evidence, this module became a lightweight war zone or a bloodbath, whatever you want to call it. But they found bangers everywhere. And even though these guys got the drop on the Africanos and caught most of them off guard, some of them had pieces, and as soon as this kicked off, they also got busy. So when it was all said and done, Spanky, Smiley, and Shadow all went to trial together. And after a short trial, the jury deliberated before lunch and had a verdict by the time lunch was over. All 3 of them got found guilty on every count. The jury found Spanky, Smiley, and Shadow guilty of first-degree homicide, and they also agreed that the 3 of them used a deadly weapon during the commission of this homicide. And of course, they also agreed that this homicide was committed for the benefit of a criminal street gang, and they hit all 3 of them with their customary 186.22. So Spanky was sentenced to 51 years to life for first-degree homicide. Smiley and Shadow were each sentenced to an indeterminate term of 25 years to life for first-degree homicide and an additional year for the use of a deadly weapon. On a separate note, Lefty and Thumper also went to trial, but after a jury determined that their involvement and participation was a lot less culpable, they were both found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, and they were sentenced to terms that range between 12 and 16 years in state prison. And since this happened in 2004, both of them have already paroled. So after 6 young lives were destroyed over another senseless act of violence, it doesn't seem like there's any winners at the end of this story either. Little Vamp suffered an untimely demise at a relatively young age, and these 5 guys all went to prison behind a purpose and a lifestyle that they all glorified. Lefty and Thumper have a chance to pull themselves out of that abyss before it's too late. However, as for the other 3, it looks like they have a long, arduous, tough road ahead of them. So after doing some additional digging, I found out that an individual by the name of Guillermo Navarro, which is also Spanky's real name, was involved in another homicide that occurred in Kern Valley State Prison on May 1st of 2020. Everything lines up, including the name, the dates when he entered CDCR, where he came from, and where he was housed, Kern Valley State Prison. So I'm about 90% positive based on what I was able to find out that this is also Spanky. There's always the possibility that I could still be wrong, but based on everything that I was able to find out, I'd be willing to bet that this is him. And according to the report, Spanky, along with another individual by the name of Charles Garibay, were both charged and convicted with taking out another inmate by the name of Rafael Navarro. So this is what I meant earlier when I said that Spanky had pretty much resolved himself to spending the rest of his life in prison. So today, Spanky's still housed in Kern Valley State Prison. Smiley's housed somewhere in Corcoran State Prison. And Shadow's housed somewhere in SADF, the substance abuse treatment facility that's also in Corcoran State Prison. What's the common theme here when it comes to this story and so many others like it? You guys tell me. It's something that I say all the time. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. And again, something else that's extremely important that I'm going to continue to keep reminding you guys about is to not only hit the like, drop a comment, and share the video, but also hit the all symbol on the notification bell so that you're notified anytime I drop content on this channel. So with that being said, as always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and for also continuing to tap into this channel. And before I sign off, let me just say that hopefully I'm able to get this story out to you guys and that my computer doesn't glitch out. In the meantime, you guys enjoy the rest of your day, keep pushing that positivity, and until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.